So this video is going to talk to you about the study guide for World War One. Especially right now, I'm just going to focus on the vocab, just reviewing the most important vocab. So the first word is Espionage Act. This was an act passed in the United States, and it was supposed to prevent people from helping the Germans or anybody on the other side. I don't know if you guys remember this, but during World War One, there was a lot of like anti-German feelings in the United States. So it also made it illegal to refuse military duty, and more than 1,000 people were jailed for disagreeing with the war. So anybody that protested the war under the Espionage Act passed in the United States, it would become like they would get punished for doing anything that didn't seem to line up with the government's goals. The AEF stands for the American Expeditionary Force. This was so when the United States entered the war, this was a group that was that volunteered to go first before the United States started using the Selective Service Act to recruit people and draft them to go to the war. So these were volunteers. They were commanded by General John Pershing, and they arrived just in time to save the Allies from being overrun by the Germans. So it was the arrival of the American Expeditionary Force that kind of stopped the Allies from losing completely. The United States came just in time. Trench warfare is the style of fighting from World War One. It's where you have like two opposite ditches on each side. In the middle, there's something called no man's land. And people will shoot like across those two ditches. So during World War One, there was more than 400 miles of trenches. They were cold, wet, dirty, nasty. A lot of people died just from the conditions, and also it caused a stalemate, like where both sides were equally matched. Part of that had to do with the fact that, like, it's hard to move forward if like your battle lines are these huge ditches that you dig. In order to move forward, you literally have to charge and take over the enemy's ditch, like trench, and then you can start moving. And otherwise, you're just going to have to dig another huge trench. So that really made it hard to move the battle lines. U-boats were German submarines. These were new technology that were introduced during World War One. It was really hard to fight against because we didn't have like sonar. That's not the right word. We didn't have like all the technology that can detect the submarines. So when especially the Americans were sending stuff to the Allies from our country, like we were sending supplies and stuff, the submarines or the U-boats were taking out any ships that crossed into their waters. And when they did this, like when they shot down any ships that crossed into their waters, this was called unrestricted submarine warfare. It means like even passenger ships and things like that, it didn't matter who they were. It didn't have to be a battleship. The Germans would shoot that down. And that's actually going to be one of the reasons the United States comes into the war. Nicholas II was the last Tsar or the King of Russia. So when the war was just starting, he didn't want to mobilize Russia right away after Serbia was attacked, even though he had promised to do it. And actually, that kind of like made the Russians fall behind a little bit. And he was heavily criticized for this by his own people. And later, he's going to be overthrown by a communist group called the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution, and then Russia is going to be forced to drop out of the war, like right before the end. Mobilize means to prepare for war. Russia was slow to prepare for war. And when you mobilize, you get ready to move. So they needed to prep their troops, get their equipment, supplies, things like that. Nationalism is the idea that your country is superior. This is also one of the causes of World War One. It ended up leading a number of German states to join together in 1871 to form the German Empire. They used to be kind of scattered, and this is going to end up being one of those things because Germany's united. They're going to be strong enough to get into World War One. And nationalism is also going to cause division in some other places, like the Balkans, like with the Serbians, Bosnians, Russians, like that kind of thing. An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. So the Central Powers are going to be the ones that have to declare an armistice first. So this is usually what happens to end a war. because in Germany and Austria they were having food riots and strikes. Soldiers were deserting and were getting captured. In November, the Allies reached a peace agreement with Austria, and this was soon going to be followed by Germany. The war ended on November 11th of 1918 and was followed by the Treaty of Versailles. The Zimmerman Note was one of the causes for the United States to get involved in the war. It was a message intercepted. It was a secret telegram sent by the Germans and published by U.S. newspaper. It was sent to Mexico and was trying to encourage them to attack the United States. And at this point, the United States was not involved in the war yet. So this is going to make us really mad. Like, why, Germany, would you try to get our neighbors to attack us if we're not even involved in the war? I think they thought it would keep the United States like tied up fighting against the Mexicans, and that we would never be able to like get involved in the war. So when we find the note and it gets published in our U.S. newspapers, we declare war on Germany in April of 1917, just in time for us to come in and tip the balance of power in favor of the Allies. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne. He was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian who was angry about Austria's takeover of Bosnia. His murder is actually going to be the spark that starts World War I. And he was murdered by Gavrilo Princip. Liberty bonds were like the things that we were selling in the United States to raise money for the war. So it's almost like you buy a bond, and it's almost like you can give the government a loan when you buy a bond. So this is going to allow the U.S. government to provide loans to the Allies for food and war supplies. And it's kind of like buying a savings bond now. Like right now, you could go to the bank and tell them you want to buy a bond, and you might pay $5 for it. And if you hold on to that bond for like 10 years, it might be worth $7 in 10 years. But yeah, it's kind of a way that the government can borrow money from us. No man's land was the area between trenches where nobody could go into because they would for sure die. Usually between trenches, it would be about 200 to 1,000 yards wide. A lot of the fighting took place in this area when people would try to charge and jump over into the enemy's trenches. But a lot of times people would die when they would jump out of the trench and try to go into no man's land. They would just get shot by the soldiers from the opposite side. Gavrilo Princip was the guy who assassinated Franz Ferdinand and his wife. He was a member of a nationalist organization called the Black Hand. He was angry about Austria-Hungary taking over Bosnia because of all the Serbians living in Bosnia. He thought that Bosnia should either belong to Serbia or be independent as Bosnia. Bolsheviks were the revolutionary group in Russia who took over the government. So they were communists. They were extreme, they were very extreme in their beliefs. They wanted to redistribute wealth and end private property, which in Russia there was major differences in social status and wealth. So that can be one of the reasons that people end up going for communism, because it's so unequal. So they got rid of Tsar Nicholas and his family, and Russia went into a revolution and was completely taken over by communists. When Russia was taken over, when the Tsar was overthrown, Russia needed to leave the war. So they declared an armistice, and then they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was between Russia and Germany, because at the time Russia was part of the Allies and Germany was part of the Central Powers. So Russia had to withdraw because of their own war. The Bolsheviks had taken control of the government. This was signed in March of 1918, almost 1 year after the United States got involved in the war. Selective service is another name for the draft. Congress passed the act in May of 1917 to require men between 21 to 30 to register for the draft. It's still required for men to register for the draft. Some people thought that it was a violation of civil liberties if people didn't agree with the draft or didn't agree with the war. Wilhelm II was the last Kaiser of Germany. Kaiser is another name for king. He thought that he wanted Germany to get into a war because he thought they would win for sure, and he thought it would be fast. So he wanted to defeat France quickly before Russia could mobilize. So he quickly tried to attack France through Belgium and then Russia, and then it didn't work, and he did step down as Kaiser after Germany lost the war. The Lusitania was, again, one of the reasons that the United States ends up getting involved in the war. It was a passenger ship that was sunk by German U-boats because of their unrestricted submarine warfare. This happened in May of 1915. Don't forget, the United States still won't get involved for almost 2 more years. But it did make American people angry because it was a passenger ship and there were Americans on it. And the U.S. was still neutral in the war. However, the ship was carrying war materials coming from the United States going to Great Britain. Militarism is another cause of World War I. It's when you glorify the military, you celebrate the military. A lot of countries before World War I began building up their military as things became more tense in Europe. And when you build up your military, it causes other people around you to get nervous. So it caused more tension. It's going to end up causing like the war. And it's because like they wanted to create a balance of power. So your neighbor gets a gun, so you get a bigger gun. Then they get nervous that you have a big gun, so they get an even bigger gun. So then you get an even bigger gun. That's kind of what it looked like. And the last one is the Sedition Act. It's very similar to the Espionage Act, which espionage means spying. Sedition means that you would betray your government. So this was passed during World War I. They wanted to force people to support the war. So if you criticize the government or criticize the war under the Sedition Act, you'd be thrown in jail for disagreeing with them. And most people would say this violates the Constitution, which guarantees us freedom of speech. So those are the World War I study guide vocabulary answers.